Van Helsing! You murderer!
In the days of yore, before streaming gave us instant access to most of everything ever made, before franchise filmmaking was a safe bet, and even before VHS had been replaced by DVD, an impressionable young me knew very little of Dracula, Frankenstein and the Wolfman, in fact only knowing the latter from being referenced in a Sabrina the Teenage Witch novelization. Then one day at my best friend's house, we were shown a movie that would change my life.
Some say you're a murderer, Mr. Van Helsing. Others say you're a holy man. Which is it?
In 2004, which is nearly 2 decades ago,
Oh, help.
Stephen Sommers was best known for helming a movie that everyone was convinced would crash and burn, but ended up becoming brilliant in just about every way and succeeding on every possible level, getting a successful sequel and spin-off in the process, and so the universe decided it was time for him to do that in reverse.
You're the great Van Helsing.
You're a deranged psychopath.
Van Helsing was a movie that Universal had high hopes for. They went to the trouble of renaming him Gabriel rather than Abraham, as he had been in Bram Stoker's novel, so they could maintain exclusive rights to the character, convinced they just created the next big action hero. There were plans for a sequel, and also a TV series involving a Wild West sheriff battling monsters in that village. And they were stopped in their tracks by the box office gross.
Oh, I'm sorry about that too.
Now, 300 million worldwide would be considered a hit if the production budget hadn't been at least 160 million, not counting marketing costs, and dreadful reviews. Seriously, this thing has a 24% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and even removed from the 2004 release, critical opinion is still pretty low.
Van Helsing.
And once I became a too-school-for-cool teenager and realized that some stuff I liked as a child could only be liked by someone who hadn't been on this earth long enough to have a sense of taste, I became aware of how camp and OTT things were, and filed this away in the Batman and Robin category of things only a dumb kid would think was cool. But let's be real. Dislike of anything that seems camp is very rooted in early 2000s homophobia, sexism, and what have you, and we live in a slightly more enlightened time now. I appreciate things like Charlie's Angels 2000 and Sleepaway Camp for being what they are, and being mindful of slating things for what they aren't. I mean, Spartacus Blood and Sand is extremely manly camp, but camp nonetheless. And because it knew exactly what it was, and invited the audience to enjoy its shameless gratuity, it holds up considerably better than Game of Thrones and its attempts to be edgy and profound post-season 4. So, to hell with the term guilty pleasure, I am going to say this on the record. Van Helsing is the f***ing best. So our movie right here is similar in spirit to The Mummy, which was designed to be a throwback to the pulp adventure stories of the 1930s. Van Helsing is one to the Universal horror films of the same decade through to the 50s, to the point that Gilman of Creature from the Black Lagoon was going to be a guard in the castle early on. Our title character is loosely inspired by the famous vampire expert in Bram Stoker's pioneering novel, who has enjoyed great press as Dracula's ultimate nemesis thanks to Peter Cushing's portrayal in numerous Hammer films.
I'd hate to be such a nuisance.
Renamed from Abraham to Gabriel, and reimagined as a hip kid brother, he encounters Dracula, naturally, as well as Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, and even Mr. Hyde.
It's been a pleasure knowing you.
And sweet Jesus, is this movie just a visual treat? Maybe I'm just fatigued from all the endless digital backdrops or the stark look that every Netflix film seems to have these days, but I forgot just how great the visuals in Van Helsing are. Yes, there is some pretty dated CGI, but these were still the days when you built practical sets and used miniatures and matte paintings, not to mention still shooting on film. I mean, I love digital for its practicality, but there's no denying that film has a special look. In terms of the sets, the film utilizes what's known as Universal's Court of Miracles for the Transylvanian village, which Todd Browning's Dracula, James Whale's Frankenstein, and George Wagner's The Wolfman were all filmed on. The opening recreates the mob scene of Frankenstein. The creature survives the burning of the windmill because of a body of water underneath, as he does in The Bride of Frankenstein. He's encased in a block of ice as a nod to Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and in fact, the concept of a heroic Wolfman against Dracula with the creature thrown in was actually done in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This movie is clearly filled with a lot of love for that era, and it's one that still doesn't get much of it. which is why I enjoyed Werewolf by Night way more than I was expecting to. Just like he did with The Mummy, Stephen Sommers knew exactly what kind of movie he was making, and indeed homaging. Even the theatrical way Dracula and his brides behave could be rationalised as a deliberate nod to Bela Lugosi's rather stagey performance in the 1931 film.
Everybody else fears me. Not my bride.
While it's not as effective as The Mummy in translating its homages to then-modern sensibilities, it does a good job at merging the mid-2000s fantasy blockbuster with the 1930s monster movie.
It's alive!
I just love this movie's atmosphere. I am nowhere near an expert on steampunk, but I am all about the aesthetic. Castles Valerius, Frankenstein, and Dracula are just... How can I give a serious academic critique on film sets that are just so cool?
Why not?
Well,
There's even a sequence during a masquerade ball on All Hallows Eve using Cirque du Soleil performers that's just...
and if I know Van Helsing, which I do,
Just about everything from the forest to the village. Hell, even the couple of minutes we spend in Paris and the bell tower in Notre Dame are dripping with atmosphere. I could happily see an entire Hunchback crossover taking place in this Paris.
Paris!
While The Mummy is the objectively better film and story, I'll give Van Helsing the W in terms of production design and atmosphere. Even with some dated CGI, it is a spectacular movie to look at. But I can only gush about the visuals and stay coherent for so long, so let's take a look at our hero. I don't believe I quite know what the internet's judgment of Hugh Jackman is nowadays. He headlined a juggernaut of a musical that made breadtubers seethe in an oh-so-satisfying way, and still gets ribbed for that Les Mis movie that I still can't believe was a thing, but people loved Logan, so I guess it's an even split. This is right before his mid-2000s stint at moving towards smaller films and proving he could act, which is where my favourite performances of him come from. And if we're comparing him to the lead in The Mummy, then obviously B-Frey wins easily, but this is a perfectly good use of your Hugh Jackman.
You shattered the rose window.
Well, not to split hairs here, but it was Mr. Hyde who did the shattering.
As he's once again playing an immortal action hero with amnesia, he's not exactly challenged with this material, but he has fun in multiple parts, and even gets to have a big dramatic crying scene where he brings it the same way he did in The Fountain. Although using an English-sounding accent for the most part, there are moments where American pronunciations slip through, which I originally attributed to exhaustion from filming X-Men 2 at the same time, but since this character doesn't actually know his past and has vague memories of ancient times, before eventually being revealed as a fallen angel, I'm now kind of thinking that it would make sense for him to not have one specific accent.
Because we do not exist.
Well, then neither do I.
Everyone else in this movie is region-specific, so we're not just taking RP for granted because it's olden times, so I'm going to assume it's a deliberate choice.
You cursed. Not very well, mind you, but you're a monk. You shouldn't curse at all.
As a lead character, Van Helsing is perfectly fine.
You already lost your memory as a penance for past sins.
He functions as the blank slate or vanilla piece in the equation to allow the audience to experience the more colourful world around him. And while I won't say he's the most interesting character, he serves his purpose and leads the film nicely.
Do you understand forgiveness?
Yes. I asked for it often.
What I noticed on my most recent watch is how this character actually has a lot of backstory, eventually revealed to be none other than the angel Gabriel, cursed with memory loss as a punishment for past sins, and him being the one who killed Dracula in 1462. And he does have some angst over the fact that he can't remember anything of his life, and that he has a reputation as a murderer, but this stuff is actually played down.
It must be such a burden, such a curse, to be the left hand of God.
Not that he's underdeveloped, by the end of the film you know plenty about him, but this backstory is conveyed almost through osmosis and doesn't bloat the story.
We have such history, you and I, Gabriel.
It's not incredible, groundbreaking writing, but it makes him feel like a developed character who isn't taking screen time away from more interesting folks.
Yeah, to have memories of those you loved and lost is perhaps harder than to have no memories at all.
This is how you make an amnesiac character not suck. Although since I'm doing all the hot takes today, I'll say that 2002's Resident Evil actually did the protagonist with amnesia trope best.
Now that I have your attention.
With hopes for more movies, presumably delving into his past a bit more, after this one reveals he murdered Dracula, they still give him a complete arc that allows the movie to be self-contained without focusing on saving all the good stuff for a hypothetical sequel.
He'll give you back your life, your memory.
Some things are better left forgotten.
And since I really currently dig stuff about fallen angels, see the Aussie film Gabriel, that's a check in the win column. Next. So the 2000s was an interesting time for Kate Beckinsale. She had begun her career playing English roses in period dramas, but suddenly Underworld and this turned her into an action star, and for some reason it took until 2016 for the world to realise just how magnificently hilarious this lady is.
Tell the people what you travel with.
A pantomime horse costume.
And I don't know why, but the internet really gives Anna a hard time.
I can handle this myself.
So I noticed.
I actually felt personally attacked when I saw she was branded with the one trope younger me tried his hardest to get cut from TV tropes, the dreaded faux action girl, which on paper is meant to criticize heroines presented as powerful and badass, and yet doesn't demonstrate what she's touted as, but in execution is more like the opposite of the Mary Sue label. If you're automatically good at everything and win every fight, you're a Mary Sue. If you mess up, even realistically if you were training in the setting, you're a faux action girl. And even worse, a damsel in distress.
The damsel in distress, young woman in trouble definition is absolutely too broad to be useful.
Now, since there are finally discussions being had about how the damsel in distress labeling is as bullshit as the male gaze and Bechdel test, let's briefly outline what a DID is supposed to be and why Anna doesn't qualify. Liana?
The damsel in question is the plot motivator, not knowledge, special powers, or abilities she has.
Okay, so our damsel only counts as a distressed one if she is a complete innocent put in peril to move the plot along, and conflict comes from a threat to her safety or virtue. Right away, Anna doesn't fit the parameters because she is not a complete innocent who has nothing to do with the conflict.
Stay here!
You stay here! You're trying to kill me!
She's part of the action because her entire family has to kill Dracula, and the ones who died trying are stuck in purgatory until they succeed.
He was to kill Dracula in return for eternal salvation of his entire family, right down the line, all the way to you.
The one time she's captured, she's being used as a hostage because it's the creature Dracula really wants, and kidnapping her is mostly a trick anyway.
I won't let you trade me, Count.
I have no intention of trading.
If there's a true damsel in distress character in the movie, it's arguably the creature. Anytime Anna ends up in distress is because she's willingly inserted herself into a combat situation.
No, Anna! It will kill you!
That's my brother out there!
In her first scene, she's chased by the werewolf because she was going for the gun her brother dropped when he was the one in distress, and the werewolf was supposed to turn one of them for Dracula's experiment to work. When the village is attacked, she's literally the only target as the last Valerius, and considering she's got 3 flying vampires after her, she does quite well in surviving the encounter, even at one point freeing herself when Alira catches her off guard. She only gets subdued when she's double-teamed, and even then tries to fight them off. She gets a hit in on the werewolf before she finds out it's her brother, which is why there's no more fighting against him.
If there's a chance I can save my brother, I'm going after it.
In Frankenstein's castle, she is actively trying to save her brother when he's strapped to the machine. And that's the thing with Anna. She's an active character. She does things. She influences the plot, makes mistakes, has motivations, strengths, weaknesses.
I'm sorry you have to carry this burden alone.
On the contrary, I would wish for it no other way.
Seriously, as an action heroine, she's fine. Actually, she's better than fine. She saves Van Helsing enough times, and displays a lot of quick thinking and initiative in certain moments. And for some reason, she still gets hit with the faux action girl tag when she pulls off things like this. Killing Alira apparently doesn't count because she's a female and action heroics only count against males.
Think if you're going to kill someone, kill them! Don't stand there talking about it!
The reason Van Helsing is the superior combatant is because he's a fallen angel who's been trained to hunt monsters, while Anna is a human who's also got an emotional stake in the game, reeling from all the losses she's suffered.
He gave his life for me. He's the only family I have left.
She is nowhere near as earth-shatteringly amazing as Evie from The Mummy, but few gals are anyway.
You know, nasty little fellows such as yourself always get their comeuppance.
They do?
Oh, yes. Always.
And I quite like Anna for what she brings to the table. I even find myself connecting to the romance between her and Van Helsing, despite Kid Me complaining about everyone always kissing in action movies.
Don't be late.
Here you have two people with nothing in their lives but fighting evil. He has no family and no memories of anything else, with only the vague hope that he might get that one day. She's lost all her family, and all she has is memories, with her only hope being that their deaths won't be in vain. And the two find one small bright spot in all that just for a moment. For this brief moment in time, they have something to live for besides their mission, and it's likely that neither of them has ever had a chance to fall in love before, so this kiss is the only chance they'll get before heading into the final battle that both of them are sure they won't fully make it out of.
It doesn't matter what happens to me. We must save my family.
If you're late, run like hell.
And I never thought this bit of Anna in the clouds was silly or ridiculous whatsoever. I just found it sweet, confirming that she's with her family once again, and says goodbye to the man who helped reunite them. And if Anna was a damsel in distress, that would also be fine, because there is nothing wrong with a female character needing help.
Who will show courage if not me?
If you go out there alone, you'll be outmanned and outpositioned, and you can't see in the dark.
And if anything, this movie has made me realize that I miss glamorous action girls who don't have to shed their femininity to be empowered. Moving on. Although this movie sells itself as a love letter to the universal horror films from Hollywood's golden age, the problem with the jumping off point for our chief antagonist is that it's a bit not good. Seriously, Frankenstein and the Wolfman, awesome films that hold up. Dracula?
Indeed.
It is a heavily streamlined version of Bram Stoker's novel, and hindered by the fact that it's adapting an already not great stage play that's practically the poster child for the slogan, I can't tell if it's minimalist or just Thus, Van Helsing takes a lot more from Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 adaptation, with details such as 1462 being the year Dracula became a vampire, his motivation involving sticking it to the big guy upstairs, and even certain aesthetic choices.
Take me away from all this death.
His chief bride in that was played by Italian supermodel Monica Bellucci, and Van Helsing casts that role with Sylvia Colocca, who was frequently compared to her. It is also a breath of fresh air to see this movie using the more modern tragic vampire trope, but also not forgetting that these characters are still evil.
I could never allow him to be used for such evil. I could.
He's got sympathetic motivations in wanting his offspring to live, but also, since there's thousands of them and we know what vampire children are like,
They need to feed. Teach them hard.
in some ways it almost feels like a parody or deconstruction of the tragic vampires that would oversaturate the market by the end of the decade.
I feel no love, nor fear, nor joy, nor sorrow.
This is a great Dracula. The bar was set high for a new take on the character besides tragic and or sexy love interest, and this movie does a good job at hyping up the mystique surrounding him.
You've never faced one like this before.
Even in details such as not showing his bat form until the final act really sells him as this otherworldly, unstoppable villain.
Is this your silver steak?
Possibly I'm biased because this was one of my first on-screen Draculas, but this certainly does the character and his reputation justice. And Richard Roxburgh, it took me rewatching Moulin Rouge to see just how he disappeared into this role.
You can't kill me, Victor.
He understood the assignment and the right way the scenery should be chewed so that it enhances the viewing experience.
I'm already dead.
He's equal parts elegant and intimidating, threatening and seductive, and commands every scene.
A triumph of science over.
It's not easy to share the screen with Hugh Jackman and come across as the more dominant one, but here he goes.
Then the only way to kill them is to kill you.
Got it.
And little details like him setting a crucifix on fire and being all chill about it.
Perhaps that is a conversation for another time.
While I haven't seen every iteration of Dracula and can't acutely say which version is best, I will say that this is the best version for this kind of film. He doesn't need my permission to take a bow, but go ahead anyway. I'm not as well versed in Frank here as Dracula, mostly because I read the book once and that was enough for me, and my favourite of his film appearances is probably The Bride of Frankenstein, but I like this reimagining of him as a sympathetic and ultimately heroic figure.
What do you want?
To exist.
Evil versus evil is very hard to do right, and of the two classic monsters, he's the easiest to turn into a good guy, since he only became evil because his would-be father didn't take responsibility for him, and he was what society made him. In this universe, Victor Frankenstein seemed to love his creation, and didn't want him to be used for nefarious purposes, and so got killed for it, so the creature has no daddy issues here. They do give the Doctor an assistant called Igor, referencing the helper character first added to the story in an 1823 stage adaptation, who was called Fritz in the 1931 film. Igor doesn't appear until Son of Frankenstein. The opening having Igor turning on the Doc to join Dracula might be a nod to Bela Lugosi originating that role. This film also restores the book's characterization of the monster as more intelligent and well-spoken once he's been out in the world, as opposed to pop culture's view of him as an innocent child in a monster's body not knowing his own strength, or else a monstrous brute.
Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil!
His function in the story is a good way to bring him into the conflict without contriving a vendetta against Dracula and bloating the film with backstory.
I am the key to my father's machine.
Drax needs him to make Dr. Frankenstein's machine work and bring his offspring to life, which incorporates Mary Shelley's intended message of not trying to play God, and then reframes it as more like certain people shouldn't do so. And then they go and reveal Van Helsing as an angel.
This thing, man, whatever it is, evil may have created it, may have left its mark on it, but evil does not rule it, so I cannot kill it.
This movie has a lot of layers, and I'm only 50% joking. But yeah, this is a perfectly good use of the one movie monster I could never connect to, and Shuler Hensley is nicely cast.
Thank you.
He's made quite the career out of playing the creature, most notably in Young Frankenstein on Broadway, and his steampunk redesign is also cool. Wouldn't put it on a Tinder profile, but it works well enough for this kind of movie. And since this Frank Jr. is a good guy who never murders children or performs impromptu heart surgery on Daddy's new wife, he gets to survive the final battle, when it would have been all too easy to kill him, and he wanders the Earth just like his literary counterpart. Now for monster number 3. Now, mid-2010s blockbusters and tentpoles like Terminator Genisys and Jupiter Ascending came under criticism for plenty, but one of those was trying to cram too many villains into a 2-hour movie. And with a story intended as a crossover between at least 3 Universal monsters at once, you would be surprised just how well Van Helsing handles that. Firstly, they make the creature a good guy, so Dracula and his brides are the only ones to stop. And what's handy about the Wolfman, and indeed werewolves in general, is that they also have to be human sometimes, so you can just make him a pre-existing character. But since Larry is the protagonist of the original film, Van Helsing does one better by having the title character get bitten, and increase tension going into the third act.
You won't turn into a werewolf until the rising of your first full moon. That's 2 nights from now.
The Wolfman was one of the codifiers for the tragic werewolf story, so naturally we get 2 of them here. And Velkin's death is suitably sad and gives Kate Beckinsale a chance to do some acting.
I will see you again.
The design for the werewolves doesn't really resemble Larry's, and owes more to the likes of The Howling and An American Werewolf in London, which popularised the bipedal lycanthropes we know and love today. We get 3 different werewolves with 3 distinct designs, and even if the first one is my favourite, they are all very cool. I saw someone on here say something to the effect of, "This is what I picture when I think of a werewolf," and I gotta agree. Stephen Sommers also wanted to forego the typical fur-growing transformation, and instead Velkin and Van Helsing peel their skin off to change, to convey that the beast comes from within, which is neat.
Here's the plan. When the bell begins to toll midnight, you'll be able to kill Dracula.
The twist here is that a werewolf bite is the only thing that can kill Dracula, reminding me of how much we loved pitting werewolves against vampires in the 2000s, with Kate Beckinsale literally starring in a franchise about that right before this one. Despite this being a modern fad, there is a basis to it in folklore, with some werewolf legends stating that they were often connected to vampires in one way or another. In the original novel, Dracula did turn into a wolf, as depicted in the 1992 film when he turns Lucy. And there was a planned film from Universal in the 1940s titled Wolfman vs. Dracula, although the scripted climax would have had the former fighting Dracula in his human form, a route this one thankfully didn't take. Oh, and Carl reads out the poem from the original Wolfman word for word.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf.
So to reiterate, integrating the third wheel of movie monsterdom into the plot seamlessly, and doing so in a way that has a basis in the monster mashups it was homaging, and with plenty of nods and shoutouts to the source material.
The wolfbane blooms, and the moon is shining bright.
But that's enough about the upper card monsters, because we're going to talk about the real stars of this movie. In the original novel, Jonathan Harker encounters 3 female vampires, who are actually implied to be Dracula's relatives rather than the more popular portrayals of them as wives or concubines, called the Weird Sisters instead of the Brides. They appear once more when Mina is on the verge of turning into a vampire, and Van Helsing has to protect her from them, in one of my favourite scenes in the 1992 film, before getting killed in their sleep once he storms the castle. And now, I've not seen every Dracula adaptation, but out of the ones I have, none of them have realised the potential of these characters. Except one. Stephen Sommers realised that in a universe where Dracula is an action villain and needs a formidable army to get his job done, why not use his canonical entourage and expand the Weird Sisters to become his own personal Charlie's Angels? Again, this takes more cues from the 1992 film, with how the Italian brunette is the leader rather than the blonde, and there's a redhead rather than a second brunette. And they're officially his wives, as well as one scene where they hang upside down, seemingly homaging this moment. Now, in my time in the film world, I've discovered that 99% of actresses automatically love playing 2 things: mermaids and vampires. And when you have 3 female vampires in your action movie, you witness a bigger ball than the actual masquerade one midway through. The brides all get names and expanded roles, but not to a bloated degree. You know who each one is, what they want, and what they're about. Verona is the no-nonsense queen bride, Marischka is the impulsive psycho who plays with her food too much, and Alira is the slutty bisexual who seems to want Anna for herself.
Anna, my love.
And even if Marischka gets killed very early on, she doesn't feel underdeveloped, or like wasted potential.
Too bad. So sad.
Josie Moran makes the most of her screen time, and sure, I'm actually a little sad when each of the brides dies, but she feels like a well-developed supporting character who served her purpose. And this cackling. Rather than laughing at her, we're laughing with her at just how much fun she seems to be having. Actress and character. And considering it's later said that Van Helsing is the first one in a century to actually kill a vampire, it's justified in-universe for her to be this cocky. Any cosplayers, send me evidence, please?
My darling!
Verona may be the sensible bride compared to the more colourful other 2, but that doesn't mean she's lacking in popularity. Sylvia Colocca understands that there is a time to camp it up, but also one to convey genuine emotion, and she is really doing that in scenes involving the vampire children.
My heart could not bear the sorrow if we fail again.
Again, she doesn't get long scenes to herself, but there's a lot implied, and you feel like you understand her completely.
We must not let the creature be destroyed!
There's even perfect characterization in the action scenes, where she's right there to swoop in and try and salvage things whenever the other 2 don't get the job done quick enough. And what's also interesting is that these traits get all of them killed. Marischka being too playful, Verona having to take charge all the time, and Alira being too seductive. Verona's death is especially sad, and Sylvia brings a surprising dignity to the moment. But now, we talk about bride number 3.
Did I scare you?
No.
Elena Anaya. Good sweet effing Mike, does she walk away with this film several times over.
Do you like to fly, Anna?
Alira is the best.
Be happy in the knowledge that I shall weep over your dead body.
Everything about her, from the costume to the eyes to everything. Elena Anaya went above and beyond in terms of commitment to this character.
And I say you can go when you're dead!
She even studied the movements of bats to incorporate into her mannerisms and body language, even factoring that into how Dracula and his brides show affection. What's interesting about Alira is that the script shows her to be a typical jealous girl who hates Anna because her husband likes her, but in their scenes and interactions, you feel like there's an entire unspoken history and familiarity that merely intrigues you and makes it fun to think about, rather than feeling that they were loose ends that weren't tied up.
Did I do something to you in a past life?
Don't play coy with me, princess.
And I'm not surprised that her role was expanded after Stephen Sommers loved her performance. I just wish that we could have seen her deleted part of the Masquerade Ball, and I keep seeing the confrontation between her and Anna being mockingly called a designated girl fight. Tangenting off for a moment, that usually refers to a sort of conservative shield used by creators who would like to think of themselves as pro-woman, but haven't fully thought that out yet.
I can't hit a girl.
Basically, in genre movies, they'll be unwilling to have the male hero engage in any kind of combat with a female villain, out of fear of being seen as sexist or misogynist. So it's just easier to have a female hero be the one to take her out. Take this glorious scene in one of the late great Aaliyah's only film roles, Romeo Must Die.
I don't know how it is in China, but in America, for girls kicking your ass, you do not have to be a gentleman.
Once an assassin who has nearly caused their death multiple times is revealed to be a woman, Jet Li suddenly becomes unwilling to defend himself, so he takes a magnificent third option. Now, this is a parody, so we're all good, but movies utilizing this without any irony tend to get roasted for either being shallow attempts at girl power or paying lip service to the feminist movement. As I learned very quickly in pro wrestling training, where men and women would train together, being unwilling to strike a female in a combat sports situation tends to be seen less as admirable, and more like an indicator that you see her as lesser than the men. And Van Helsing, meanwhile, does not do that. Van Helsing fights the three brides the same way he does the werewolf, Mr. Hyde, and Dracula himself, even killing Marischka personally. The reason Anna and Alira go at it so often is because the movie is building to it. It's even foreshadowed in their first encounter.
I hope you have a heart, Alira. Because someday I'm going to drive a stake through it.
The plot comes up with justified reasons for these two to fight, while Van Helsing and Dracula do. In fact, this whole third act is pretty brilliant for pairing off the protagonists with the antagonists, and having three different action set pieces going on, building nicely to the climax. So before I segue onto that, let me just reiterate. The brides, iconic. But this is an action movie, so what about what we're actually here for? An action movie is a lot like a musical, where songs function in the same way as the action beats, conveying characterization and plot twists through other means besides exposition. A song should happen in the narrative for no reason beyond there being no better way to convey the necessary information. Part of your world is the best way to get the viewer to understand why Ariel is so fascinated with the human world that she can be tricked into making a deal to become part of it. Colors of the Wind is the perfect representation of Pocahontas, conveying why her culture is just as valid as John Smith's, and convincing him to change his perspective. Tonight is the only way to really sell Tony and Maria falling so madly in love that they'll risk the backlash from their respective sides to be together, and action scenes should function in the same way. Since I spent forever talking about the brides, I'll open with stating that the sequence of them attacking the village is my favourite scene in the whole movie. It is just so incredibly directed, the way the attack comes out of nowhere and rockets the pace up, putting you in the perspective of the protagonists. Since the brides have only briefly appeared before, this scene is their proper introduction, with the action also being used to build character.
Kill the stranger. Love to.
Look at everything these 10 minutes accomplish.
I want first fight.
We know there is something between Dracula and Anna, as the Cardinal outlined, and the werewolf scene inferred it too, but now we can see that the three brides want Anna so desperately they'll risk coming out in daylight. And they don't just want to kill her, they want to do it theatrically, and possibly turn her into one of them. also foreshadowing the vampire's fatal flaw.
Stop your teasing, Mariska, and finish him!
I think if you're going to kill someone, kill them. Don't stand there talking about...
Their other weaknesses like sunlight, holy water, and getting them in the heart are conveyed throughout with the minimum of exposition, so that you're learning how they can be stopped as the movie is going on, rather than a pause to explain everything.
Oh, it's not working! Try aiming at their hearts!
We also get that connection between Anna and Alira established to start the build towards one of Anna's big moments. And we learn plenty about Anna, with how she tries to get everyone else to safety because it's her the vampires are after, and how she retreats inside to stop them going after the villagers. And even outside the information and characterization being conveyed, this scene is just so well done. Like a volcano, it erupts immediately to excite the audience and bring them into the moment, then it levels off just as quickly to build tension, before erupting a second time and escalating even more as the brides come closer to getting Anna. The tempo goes down again to allow the audience a chance to breathe and dissect all the information the movie told us without actually telling us, and then one final eruption, slower and more drawn out, climaxing at Mariska getting killed for a sort of mini finale then and there. I'm so used to action scenes being thrown into movies to keep the audience from getting bored between exposition dumps that I only recently came to realize just why I love this one so much. We see the same deal with the action scene that introduces Velkin, Anna, and the werewolf.
Dracula unleashed you for a reason.
It tells us that the Valerius siblings will be taking the fight to Dracula one way or the other, that Dracula has monsters besides his brides to carry out his dirty work, that Anna cares very much for her brother, and what a werewolf's strengths and weaknesses are.
Find Velkin's gun! It has to be the silver bullet!
And of course, the fight with Mr. Hyde tells us everything we need to know about Van Helsing, who may be a monster hunter with cool gadgets, but he relies just as much on his wits as he does weapons. Those are all first act sequences, giving the necessary information the audience needs. As we move into the second act, the sequences become much shorter, laying the groundwork for the payoff in the third. This is where the movie's horror influences come into play, allowing for a second act that's still exciting to watch without exhausting us before the finale starts paying things off. The big action set piece that closes the second act is the carriage chase in the woods, which merges the two genres very effectively, first starting as a horror scene and then becoming an action one.
What are you doing out here?
It also accomplishes the plot-relevant thing of the creature helping the protagonists and earning Carl's respect, as well as the deaths of Verona and Velkin. As we move into the third act, the pace slows down with the masquerade ball sequence to give us a chance to relax, and then give the protagonists a win with Carl's sun bomb trick. And then when we reach Castle Dracula, we set the stage for the main event, and the payoff starts once Alira ambushes Anna and Carl, eventually splitting off into 3 separate action sequences. And although the Van Helsing vs. Dracula fight is actually my least favourite one in the film, I can still acknowledge that it's paced just as it should be, and doesn't run too long. Perhaps because the movie has wisely hinged its third act tension not on will Dracula be killed, but will Van Helsing be cured in time, so it makes sense for it not to be drawn out. And considering this was longer than an average movie at the time, but shorter than most releases today, it makes it feel all the fresher that it knows when to wrap things up. Kind of the opposite to this video essay. As I said in the intro, Van Helsing was not considered a flop when it came out, but it was definitely a disappointment in terms of the franchise-starting mega-hit Universal were hoping for. There have been 2 plans for a reboot, the first one being a vehicle for Tom Cruise, which was ironically sunk when he dropped out to do the 2017 Mummy movie, another intended kickstart for a franchise featuring the Universal monsters. History repeated with a decent box office gross that performed very well outside America, but even worse critical reviews than Van Helsing. As you don't want to build a franchise on a movie whose Rotten Tomatoes score isn't old enough to drink, but also don't want to give up on an existing IP, that shared universe was cancelled, and talk of a Van Helsing reboot resurfaced in 2020. But the disappointment that was The Mummy 2017 and Dracula Untold saw people looking back to the most recent time we saw various familiar monsters on screen together.
Vampires, gargoyles, warlocks, they're all the same.
And Stephen Sommers was even asked for his thoughts on a potential shared Universal franchise featuring these characters.
Most good movies are because people really love what they're doing. You also have to understand why you love it and why it works and why it worked for you. I'm from Minnesota, and I watched the original Boris Karloff Mummy as a kid. It took place in ancient Egypt and Cairo of the 20s and 30s. They shot it in Bakersfield, but I didn't know that. It just seemed really exotic and cool. The same with Frankenstein and Dracula and the Wolfman. I understand why I love them and why they worked for me, and apparently worked for other people as well.
And despite the plans for a potential franchise from the higher-ups, he maintains that he made the movie intending it to be self-contained, wanting to create a good solo outing before jumping to conclusions that he'd be getting a second automatically. So this was really the passion project, made after he delivered the 2 Mummy movies to box office success and got free rein to do what he wanted. The 8-minute prologue in black and white was done solely out of love for the influences, specifically to create a sequence that recreated the feeling he himself had gotten watching those movies as a child. His enthusiasm reminds me a lot of Lee Janiak, who used a similar approach to her incredible Fear Street trilogy, which likewise became the thing I was obsessed about for a long time.
I'm the weird girl from Shadyside.
Because of my love for this movie, I sought out child-friendly versions of Dracula and Frankenstein before eventually reading the originals, later watching Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and way too more to count.
You're such a beast.
Because of the critical thrashing and the way this movie was an easy target on the internet from the get-go, I either repressed or downplayed just how formative it was for me, only ever mentioning it in a joking way, like how House of Wax 2005 was my gateway to the slasher genre. Calling this movie a gateway is almost selling it short, more like the keys to the kingdom, and I don't view it as so bad it's good. It is genuinely good. It wasn't meant to be elevated horror or gritty action, and I'm 100% happy with what it did turn out to be. It has some incredible action sequences, a spectacular production design, extremely well thought out world building, some interesting interpretations of familiar characters, and in some cases, definitive reimaginings of them. It's not a guilty pleasure, because I don't think anyone should feel guilty for enjoying the things that they enjoy. Unless it's 2019's Black Christmas, that one's gonna get you judged. What I'm saying is that this movie was convicted in the court of public opinion, and has been worthy of a defense for too long. But until someone far more noteworthy decides to give Van Helsing its flowers, I'm happy to be the first.